Victor Sterling held up the gold-plated keys to a $5 million super yacht and handed them to his mistress, all while his wife stood 10 feet away, clutching a $10 gift card. The massive projection screen behind them lit up the Hamptons' night sky, displaying 150 feet of Italian fiberglass, chrome, and pure ego. The crowd of Manhattan's elite gasped, their champagne flutes pausing mid-air, as Victor announced that the vessel was for Tiffany, his 24-year-old executive assistant, whom he publicly credited for steering the ship of his life. He didn't even look at Elena, his wife of 20 years, as he shoved a crumpled envelope into her hand. Before we watch Victor lose his entire empire over this arrogant mistake, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And is emotional cheating actually worse than physical cheating? What do you think? The humiliation was designed to be a spectacle. Tiffany bounced onto the stage in a dress that cost more than most families earn in a year, feigning shock over a gift she had secretly picked out herself 3 weeks prior. She threw her arms around Victor's neck, planting a kiss on his cheek that lingered far too long for a strictly professional relationship. The applause from the audience was scattered and nervous. The guests shifted in their seats, glancing toward the shadowed table where Elena Sterling had been sitting alone just moments before. They watched as Victor draped his arm around his mistress, effectively replacing his wife in real time before 500 witnesses. Victor then turned his attention to Elena. He had called her up to the stage not to honor her, but to use her as a prop for his own vanity. He announced into the microphone that while Tiffany needed the high seas to unwind, Elena liked the simple things. He ripped the envelope open to reveal a bright orange, plastic card. It was a generic coffee shop gift card. Victor held it up to the light like it was a rare jewel, joking to the silent room that it would buy her 2 lattes, or maybe just one with inflation. He laughed into the microphone, telling her not to spend it all in one place. Tiffany giggled behind her hand, basking in the flash of the cameras. A few of Victor's yes men in the front row forced a laugh, but the rest of the ballroom fell into a suffocating, heavy silence. It was a public execution of a marriage. Victor waited for Elena to shrink away, to cry, or to run off stage so he could comfort Tiffany. He viewed his wife as old furniture, reliable, boring, and easily discarded. But Elena didn't shrink. She took the plastic card and looked at the $10 limit printed on the back. Then, she looked at the $5 million yacht on the screen. Finally, she looked at Victor. Her eyes were not filled with tears. They were filled with a terrifying, icy clarity. She leaned into the microphone, her voice steady and chilling the humid air, and whispered a thank you. She said it was exactly what she needed to finally wake up. The crowd waited for a scene. They leaned forward, expecting tears, a slap, or a scream. Anything to break the tension that had settled over the ballroom like a suffocating blanket. But Elena Sterling gave them nothing. After her cryptic comment about waking up, she simply nodded politely, placed the $10 gift card into her small, worn clutch, and turned her back on the billionaire. She walked down the stairs with a steady rhythm, her heels clicking against the stage in a beat that sounded less like a retreat and more like a countdown. Victor, confused and slightly irritated by her lack of reaction, tried to save the moment. He laughed into the microphone, a booming, artificial sound that echoed off the fiberglass of the yacht behind him. He mocked her passivity to the crowd, calling her grateful, and joking that this was why their marriage worked, because she knew her place. He draped his arm around Tiffany, pulling her close, effectively signaling to everyone that the replacement had been installed. Tiffany smirked, basking in the flash of the cameras, believing she had just won the lottery. But as Elena descended the stairs and moved through the sea of tables, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The guests were not tourists, they were sharks. They were business titans, old money heirs, and legal experts. They exchanged worried glances, sensing something Victor was too arrogant to feel. In their world, silence wasn't weakness, silence was a strategy. They watched as Elena didn't stop to say goodbye to anyone. She didn't look for sympathy. She walked straight past the towering ice sculptures and the open bar, pushing through the heavy double doors and out into the cool night air. Back on stage, Victor was too busy to notice the chill sweeping through the room. He was drunk on his own perceived power. He signaled for the music to restart, demanding the DJ play something upbeat to drown out the awkward, lingering silence. He grabbed the microphone again, shouting that the night was young and the bar was open. He truly believed that Elena would go home, cry into a pillow, and make him breakfast in the morning just like she had for 20 years. He had no idea that as Elena walked out those doors, the clock on his life had started ticking down. The woman he called Furniture had just become the executioner, and he was dancing on his own scaffold. The gala roared back to life, fueled by Victor's aggressive denial and the endless flow of expensive liquor. Victor and Tiffany held court in the center of the room, clinking crystal champagne flutes and laughing loudly about the name of the new yacht. Tiffany suggested calling it the Victorious, and Victor roared with laughter, slapping his knee as if it were the wittiest thing he had ever heard. He felt invincible, the king of the Hamptons, surrounded by people he thought were his friends, but who were merely drinking his wine. He began to brag to a circle of potential investors about how he had acquired the vessel. With a slur in his voice, he admitted loud enough for the waiters to hear that he had used company discretionary funds. He winked, claiming that as the CEO, the company's money was effectively his personal piggy bank. He was so confident, so untouchable, that he didn't notice the grim expressions on the faces of the board members standing near the buffet. They weren't smiling. They were listening. While Victor was busy planning his maiden voyage to the Mediterranean, a waiter navigated through the crowd. He wasn't carrying a tray of drinks. He was carrying a small silver platter with a single, folded note. He approached Victor and held it out. Victor, annoyed at the interruption, grabbed the note. It was marked urgent in red ink and bore the official stamp of the Sterling Tech Legal Department. Victor didn't even open it. He scoffed, telling the group that lawyers were just buzzkills who didn't understand visionaries like him. He pulled a gold cigar lighter from his pocket, flicked the flame, and set the corner of the unread note on fire. He held it up as it burned, laughing as the ash fluttered to the marble floor. Tiffany clapped, entranced by his reckless display of dominance. But across the room, the general counsel for Sterling Tech watched the note burn. He didn't intervene. He didn't try to stop Victor. He simply pulled out his phone, typed a message to an unknown number, and hit send. The text read, "He burned the notice. Proceed." Victor toasted to the future, completely unaware that he had just incinerated his last chance to save his fortune. The valet stand was the final stage of Elena's public humiliation. Victor didn't even offer to share the company limousine for the ride back to the city. He stood under the heated awning with Tiffany clinging to his arm, watching with a cruel smile as a battered, 10-year-old sedan pulled up to the curb. He had ordered his wife an UberX. He tossed Elena's coat at her, laughing that he didn't want to crowd her on the ride back. As Elena climbed into the back seat of the stranger's car, she watched through the rain-streaked window as Victor helped Tiffany into the back of his armored Maybach, the heavy door thudding shut with a sound of finality. As the cars merged onto the highway, Victor's phone began to dial. He wasn't calling to apologize. He was calling to twist the knife. He sat in the plush leather of his limo, sipping a fresh glass of bourbon, and waited for Elena to pick up. When she answered, he didn't even say hello. He told her that tonight had clarified everything. He didn't want to wait for the lawyers on Monday. He wanted her out. He demanded a divorce, effective immediately, claiming he was tired of pretending that she fit into his world. He waited for the sobbing. He waited for the pleading, the desperate attempts to remind him of their history, the begging to keep the house. He wanted to hear her break. But on the other end of the line, there was no crying. There was only the rhythmic sound of a turned signal and the hum of tires on wet pavement. Elena's voice came through the speaker, calm and detached. She simply told him that she was hoping he would say that. She didn't beg for the mansion. She didn't ask about alimony. She hung up the phone before he could finish his insult. Victor stared at the screen, baffled. He told Tiffany that Elena was probably in shock, too simple-minded to realize she had just lost a billion-dollar lifestyle. He didn't realize that the woman in the Uber wasn't in shock. She was already in execution mode, and she had just confirmed the one thing she needed to destroy him completely. Sunlight poured into the penthouse suite, blinding Victor as he woke up to what he believed was the first day of his absolute freedom. He stretched out in the king-sized bed, alone for a moment as he heard the shower running in the adjacent marble bathroom. His headache was pounding, a reminder of the previous night's excess, but his ego felt better than ever. He walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park, surveying the city like a monarch surveying his kingdom. He believed he owned it all: the view, the company, the woman in the shower, and the future. He decided to start the day with a grand gesture, something to cement his new life. He grabbed his phone to transfer $50,000 into Tiffany's account, a little shopping money, to replace the wardrobe she would inevitably buy that afternoon to celebrate her new status. He opened his private banking app, punched in the numbers with a smug smile, and hit transfer. He expected the green checkmark of success, the dopamine hit of spending power. Instead, the screen flashed red. A notification popped up: transaction denied, pending approval. Victor frowned, tapping the screen aggressively. He tried again. Denied. He tried a smaller amount. Denied. He stared at the phone, confused. This was his black card account, the one with no limits. He assumed it was a fraud alert, a common annoyance for men of his wealth who spent recklessly. He threw the phone onto the bed, cursing the incompetence of his bankers. He shouted toward the bathroom that they would need to stop at the branch later so he could fire someone. He convinced himself it was just a technical glitch, a minor hiccup in his perfect world. He washed his face, oblivious to the reality that the approval he needed wasn't from a bank manager, but from the wife he had just discarded. The freeze wasn't a glitch. It was the first bar of the cage slamming shut. Victor's tires screeched onto the cobblestones of the Sterling Estate driveway an hour later. He slammed the car door and stormed up the steps, ready for a fight. He had rehearsed his speech on the drive over. He was going to tell Elena that she had until noon to vacate the premises, that security would be arriving to catalog the assets, and that she wasn't to touch the silver. He kicked the front door open, shouting her name, expecting to find a broken woman weeping on the living room floor, begging for a second chance. Instead, he found the foyer eerily quiet. There were no tears. There was no screaming. There was just a neat stack of 6 cardboard boxes by the door. Elena walked out of the library, dressed not in pajamas, but in a sharp, tailored trench coat he had never seen before. She looked calm, resolved. She didn't look like a victim. She looked like someone who had just finished a tedious chore. Victor laughed, a cruel, barking sound that echoed in the high ceilings. He told her she looked like old furniture, finally being moved out for renovation. He mocked her small pile of boxes, asking if that was really all she had to show for 20 years of marriage. Elena didn't rise to the bait. She didn't argue. She simply reached into her pocket and pulled out the heavy iron key ring to the estate. She dropped them into Victor's hand. The metal felt cold against his palm. She looked him in the eye and told him to keep them safe, because he would need a place to sleep tonight, for now. Victor scoffed, tossing the keys in the air and catching them, unaware that she wasn't talking about tonight. She was warning him that this house was the only roof he had left, and even that was on borrowed time. As she walked past him toward the door, Victor felt a strange chill, but he shook it off. He had the house. He had the girl. He had the company. He thought he had won. Elena Sterling walked down the steps of the mansion she had technically owned for 2 decades. She didn't look back at the window where Victor was likely watching, waiting for her to break. At the bottom of the steps, a car was waiting. It wasn't the Uber Victor had called the night before. It was a sleek, black town car with tinted windows and diplomatic plates. The driver, a man built like a linebacker, stepped out and opened the door for her, bowing his head in deference. As Elena slid into the leather seat, she pulled out a secure phone that Victor didn't even know existed. There was only one number saved in the contacts, labeled simply as Vanguard. She pressed the call button. It rang once. A voice on the other end answered immediately, professional and crisp. "Mrs. Sterling, we received the notification from General Counsel. Are we initiating the protocol?" Elena looked out the window as the car passed the gates of the estate, gates her grandfather had built. She thought about the yacht. She thought about the gift card. She thought about the 20 years she had spent playing the role of the quiet, supportive wife, while Victor took credit for her family's legacy. She took a deep breath. "Yes," she said, her voice showing no emotion. "Freeze everything. Activate the proxy clause. And release the statement to the press in 1 hour." "Understood," the voice replied. "And Mrs. Sterling? Happy birthday." Elena hung up the phone and finally allowed herself a small, dangerous smile. The car sped off toward the city, leaving Victor in his castle, completely unaware that the siege had just begun. Tiffany wasted no time in marking her territory. Less than an hour after Elena's departure, the Sterling mansion had been transformed from a home into a war zone of discarded memories. Tiffany moved through the hallway like a tornado in Louboutins, pulling Elena's paintings off the walls and declaring them depressing. She ordered the house staff, who had served Elena for years and were currently watching in horrified silence, to bag up all of the old woman's clothes and donate them to charity immediately. She stood in the center of the master bedroom, hands on her hips, surveying the space that was still warm from Elena's presence. She told Victor that everything had to go. She wanted white leather, gold accents, and a mirror on the ceiling. Victor, desperate to keep his prize happy and distract himself from the strange feeling in his gut, agreed to everything. He told her she could burn the house down and rebuild it if she wanted to. He was the king, and she was his queen. As Tiffany rummaged through the closet, throwing Elena's modest cardigans into a trash bag, she stumbled upon a small, dusty box on the top shelf. She pulled it down, hoping for hidden jewelry. Instead, she found an old photo album. She flipped it open and burst into laughter. The photos showed a young, scrawny Victor in a cheap suit, standing next to a young Elena outside a rundown apartment. Tiffany mocked Victor's bad haircut, asking how he ever survived being that poor. Victor laughed along, ashamed of his past, eager to bury the version of himself that Elena remembered. But as Tiffany tossed the album toward the trash, a single folded document slipped out from the back cover. It was yellowed with age, titled Proxy Voting Agreement, 2004. Tiffany picked it up, her eyes scanning the dense legal jargon about revocable rights and moral clauses. She wrinkled her nose, bored by the lack of pictures. She didn't realize she was holding the smoking gun that explained why Victor was rich in the first place. She tossed the document onto the pile of trash, deciding that reading was for secretaries, not billionaires' wives. Victor stormed into the glass-walled lobby of Sterling Tech with the energy of a conquering general. He bypassed the security turnstiles, forcing the guards to scramble to open the gates for him. He wasn't alone. Tiffany was on his arm, wearing sunglasses indoors and carrying a toy dog she had bought 20 minutes ago. Victor marched straight to the elevator, ignoring the stares of the employees who had already seen the headlines about the yacht and the gift card. When he reached the executive floor, he called an immediate all-hands meeting in the open-plan workspace. He stood on a desk, literally looking down on his staff. He announced that Sterling Tech was entering a golden age. He introduced Tiffany not as his girlfriend, but as the new director of aesthetics, a position he had invented on the elevator ride up. He claimed the company needed a younger, fresher image, and Tiffany was the visionary to lead it. The CFO, a man named Marcus who had been with the company since the beginning, stepped forward. Marcus was the only person in the room brave enough to speak. He asked Victor, quietly and respectfully, how they planned to fund this golden age, given the massive withdrawal for the yacht purchase the night before. He mentioned that the board had questions about liquidity. Victor's face turned purple. He didn't answer the question. Instead, he fired Marcus on the spot. He screamed that he didn't pay Marcus to ask questions. He paid him to count the money. He told Marcus to pack his box and get out. The room went deathly silent. Victor expected Marcus to beg for his job. Instead, Marcus looked at Victor with a strange expression, pity. Marcus simply nodded, picked up his briefcase, and walked to the elevator. As the doors closed, Marcus smiled to himself, muttering that Victor clearly had no idea who actually signed the paychecks. Victor felt invincible after firing the CFO. To celebrate, he decided to take Tiffany to the most exclusive jeweler on Fifth Avenue. They swept into the store, and the manager, recognizing Victor, practically bowed. Tiffany pointed at a diamond necklace in the case, a cascade of white gold and stones worth $300,000. She told Victor it would match the yacht perfectly. Victor, eager to show off in front of the fawning staff, told the manager to wrap it up. He slapped his black titanium credit card onto the glass counter with a dull thud. The manager ran the card. He smiled, waiting for the receipt. Then, his smile faltered. He ran it again. He looked at the machine, then at Victor, sweating slightly. He apologized profusely and said the card was declined. Victor laughed. He told the man to try it again, claiming the machine must be broken because he was Victor Sterling. The manager tried a third time. Declined. The air in the store grew thin. Other customers were watching. Tiffany stopped admiring the necklace and looked at Victor with narrowed eyes. Enraged, Victor pulled out his phone and called the bank directly, putting it on speaker so the manager could hear him berate the customer service representative. He demanded to know why his unlimited card was being rejected. The representative on the line didn't apologize. In a calm, robotic voice, she informed him that a compliance hold had been placed on all accounts associated with the Sterling Family Trust. Victor screamed that he was the trust. He demanded they lift the hold immediately. The representative replied that the hold could only be lifted by the majority shareholder. Victor froze. He shouted that he was the majority shareholder. The line went silent for a moment before the representative said, "Sir, our records indicate the majority shareholder is Vanguard Holdings. Have a nice day." The line went dead. Victor stood in the silent jewelry store, the phone slipping from his hand, as the reality of his situation began to knock on the door. To understand the magnitude of Victor Sterling's impending collapse, we have to rewind the clock 20 years. Victor loves to tell magazines the story of a self-made genius, a college dropout who built an empire on ramen noodles and grit. But that story is a lie. The truth is, 20 years ago, Victor wasn't a genius. He was a broke, desperate student with a charm that far exceeded his intellect. He had the idea for the tech startup, sure, but he didn't have a dime to buy the servers. He was weeks away from eviction, maxing out credit cards and burning bridges with every bank in the city. Enter Elena. Back then, she wasn't Mrs. Sterling. She was Elena Vanguard, the quiet girl in the back of the library who wore oversized sweaters and never spoke in class. Victor only approached her because he heard a rumor that her family had money. He courted her not with flowers, but with business plans. He dazzled her with his vision of the future, playing the role of the tortured artist who just needed one break. Elena fell for him, or so he thought. In reality, Elena saw potential in the idea, and she saw a man who was desperate enough to be the face of a company she wanted to build but didn't want to lead. The turning point came in a dingy diner on a rainy Tuesday. Victor was sobbing into his coffee, admitting that he was going to lose everything before he even started. Elena reached into her bag and pulled out a checkbook. She didn't write a check for rent. She wrote a check for $500,000. Victor nearly fainted. He asked her where she got that kind of money. She simply smiled and said, "My grandfather left me a trust. I believe in you, Victor." Victor took the money without asking questions. He took the lifeline, but he made the fatal mistake of assuming that because Elena was quiet, she was weak. He assumed that her money was a gift, a tribute to his greatness. He never stopped to ask why a 20-year-old girl had a checkbook with the logo of a massive holding company on it. He took the cash, bought the servers, and started building his throne, never realizing that the foundation was made of concrete poured by the very woman he would later betray. The company took off, but the legal structure was a spiderweb that Victor was too arrogant to untangle. A month after the initial investment, Elena presented him with a stack of documents. She told him that to protect her family's privacy, since Vanguard was a name associated with old, quiet wealth, she wanted the company to be in his name. She wanted him to be the CEO, the face, the star. Victor, blinded by his own vanity, signed the papers without reading past the first page. He saw Victor Sterling, CEO, and signed with a flourish. If he had turned to page 42, paragraph 7, subsection B, he would have seen the moral turpitude and proxy clause. It was a legal bear trap. It stated clearly that the voting rights for the majority shares were held in a revocable trust. As long as Victor remained a faithful husband and a reputable leader, he could vote the shares. He could play king. But the moment he brought public disrepute to the family or committed an act of marital infidelity that caused public embarrassment, the proxy was automatically revoked. The ownership would snap back to the grantor, Elena Vanguard Sterling. Back in the present, Victor was screaming at his legal team in the back of his limo, demanding they fix the glitch at the bank. He had lived for 20 years thinking he was the owner of the house, the yacht, and the company. He had forgotten that he was essentially a tenant in his own life. He had forgotten the contract. But Elena hadn't. She had kept a copy in a fireproof box for 2 decades, waiting for the day he would force her to use it. That day had arrived, and while Victor was yelling at his lawyers to sue the bank, the clause had already executed. The trap had snapped shut, and he was still trying to run on a broken leg. Victor arrived at the Sterling Tech headquarters to find a media circus. Rumors of the frozen accounts and the scene at the jewelry store had leaked to the press within minutes, likely tipped off by the same mysterious source that had texted his general counsel. Victor, running on adrenaline and denial, decided the only way to fix this was to control the narrative. He ordered his PR team to set up a podium in the main atrium. He was going to livestream a statement to the world. He walked out to the flashes of 100 cameras, pulling Tiffany along with him. He looked ragged, sweating through his custom suit, but his eyes were manic. He stepped up to the microphone and delivered a speech that was pure delusion. He told the reporters that the rumors of financial trouble were competitor sabotage. He announced that Sterling Tech was stronger than ever and that he and his new partner, Tiffany, were steering the ship toward record profits. He smiled, waiting for the applause. But nobody clapped. The reporters were looking down at their phones. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Phones started buzzing simultaneously. A reporter from the Wall Street Journal in the front row raised her hand, not to ask a question, but to read a notification. "Mr. Sterling," she shouted over the confused murmurs. "You're talking about future profits, but are you aware that a press release was just issued by Vanguard Holdings?" Victor laughed, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Vanguard? I don't know what that is. Probably a shell company." The reporter shook her head, holding up her tablet. The screen displayed a breaking news banner. "Sterling Tech shares plummet as Vanguard Holdings recalls leadership." "Sir," the reporter continued, her voice cutting through Victor's arrogance like a knife. "The statement says that due to gross misconduct and violation of the founding trust, you have been removed as CEO effective immediately. It's signed by the chairwoman of the board, Elena Sterling." Victor froze. The color drained from his face. He looked at the camera, then at Tiffany, who was slowly backing away from him. The live stream comments were scrolling so fast they were a blur, but one word kept repeating: "Checkmate." Victor snatched the tablet from the reporter's hand, his knuckles white with rage. He stared at the screen, his eyes scanning the press release that was currently trending worldwide. It wasn't just a firing, it was a dissection. The statement from Vanguard Holdings didn't hide behind corporate jargon. It laid out the facts in brutal, bullet-point detail. It cited unauthorized use of company funds for personal luxury assets, the yacht. It cited actions bringing public disrepute to the brand, the gala humiliation. And finally, it cited the activation of the 1999 moral proxy clause. Victor threw the tablet onto the marble floor, shattering the screen. He leaned into the microphone, his voice cracking. "This is a lie. I founded this company. I am Sterling Tech. You can't fire the owner." Suddenly, a hand reached out and cut the microphone feed. The audio in the atrium died with a sharp screech. Victor spun around to see his general counsel, the man he had ignored for 20 years, standing next to him. The lawyer wasn't holding a briefcase. He was holding a security badge, Victor's badge. He leaned in close, so only Victor and the front row of reporters could hear. "Mr. Sterling," the lawyer said, his voice dropping to a whisper that felt louder than a scream. "You are confusing founder with owner. You haven't owned a voting share since 2004. You've been a proxy. And as of 9 a.m. this morning, your proxy is dead." Victor stared at him, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The lawyer signaled to the security team standing in the wings. "Please escort Mr. Sterling off the premises. He is no longer authorized to be in the building." As the guards stepped forward, the cameras flashed blindingly, capturing the exact moment the king realized he was just the jester. Victor didn't wait to be dragged out. He shoved a security guard, grabbed Tiffany's hand, and sprinted for the side exit. He hit the parking lot, breathless and manic. He convinced himself this was just a coup, a temporary misunderstanding that he could fix if he just got his hands on the original paperwork. He shoved Tiffany into the passenger seat of his car and peeled out of the lot, tires smoking. He drove like a madman toward the city apartment, the one place he felt was truly his. He kept muttering to himself, "I have the deed. I have the deed in the safe. They can't touch the real estate." Tiffany sat in silence, clutching the door handle, texting her friends to ask if the rumors about his bankruptcy were true. When they arrived at the penthouse, Victor sprinted to the master bedroom. He tore the painting off the wall to reveal the hidden wall safe. He spun the dial, his birthday, of course, and yanked the heavy door open. He reached in, expecting to feel the thick paper of property deeds, stock certificates, and bonds. His hand grasped air. The safe was empty. Wait, not entirely empty. In the far back corner, sitting alone on the cold metal shelf, was a single object. Victor pulled it out. It was the $10 coffee shop gift card. Attached to it was a yellow sticky note with Elena's handwriting. It read, "I told you not to spend it all in one place. You're going to need this." Victor stared at the plastic card. He flipped the safe upside down, shaking it, looking for the millions he had stashed away. Nothing. Elena hadn't just taken the company. She had liquidated the contingency fund. She had cleaned him out before he even knew the game had started. Denial is a powerful drug. Even with the empty safe staring him in the face, Victor refused to accept defeat. He told Tiffany that the safe was just a decoy, that his real money was offshore, untouchable by U.S. courts. He claimed they needed to get to international waters immediately. He decided they would take the yacht, the Sea Queen, and sail to the Cayman Islands until this blew over. They raced to the marina. The yacht was still there, gleaming in the afternoon sun, prepped for the maiden voyage he had bragged about the night before. Victor felt a surge of relief. "See," he shouted to Tiffany, pointing at the boat. "They can't take the ship. It's maritime law." He marched up the gangway, barking orders at the crew to cast off immediately. He demanded champagne and caviar on the sun deck. He ignored the strange looks the deckhands were giving him. He poured himself a drink, turned up the sound system, and blasted music to drown out the sirens of his collapsing life. He stood on the bow, holding his glass up to the sun, trying to force the reality of his wealth to remain true. But the engines didn't start. The boat didn't move. Instead, the music abruptly cut out. The silence on the dock was deafening. The captain, a man Victor had hired personally, walked out onto the sun deck. He wasn't wearing his captain's hat. He was holding a clipboard. "Start the engines." Victor screamed. "I pay your salary." The captain looked at Victor, then at Tiffany, and finally at the repo agents walking up the dock behind them. "Actually, Mr. Sterling," the captain said, "Vanguard Holdings pays my salary. And I have direct orders from the owner to keep this vessel docked. You are trespassing on private property." Victor dropped his glass. It shattered on the teak deck, the sound marking the end of the party and the beginning of the end. The silence on the dock was broken not by the roar of the yacht's engines, but by the wail of approaching sirens. Victor stood on the deck of the Sea Queen, his champagne glass shattered at his feet, watching as 3 police cruisers and a black van marked Asset Recovery skidded to a halt at the marina gates. He didn't run. He couldn't. His legs felt like lead. He simply watched as uniformed officers marched up the gangway, pushing past the confused crew. Victor tried to muster the last shreds of his authority. He puffed out his chest, pointing a trembling finger at the lead officer. He shouted that this was a misunderstanding, a civil matter, a prank by his bitter ex-wife. He threatened to have their badges. He threatened to buy their precinct and turn it into a parking lot. But the officers didn't blink. They weren't there to negotiate. The lead officer didn't pull out handcuffs. He pulled out a folded document. He handed it to Victor, who snatched it aggressively. It wasn't an arrest warrant. It was a temporary restraining order. But it wasn't commanding him to stay away from Elena. It was commanding him to stay away from all assets owned by Vanguard Holdings, including the yacht he was standing on. The repo agents moved efficiently, like vultures picking at a carcass. They began tagging the furniture on the deck. They escorted the crew off the boat. Victor stood amidst the chaos, the paper shaking in his hand. The paparazzi, alerted by the police scanners, had lined up behind the chain-link fence of the marina. They zoomed in their lenses, capturing the exact moment Victor Sterling was evicted from his own fantasy. The flashes popped like lightning, illuminating a man who had everything yesterday and owned nothing today. Tiffany watched the scene unfold from the safety of the yacht salon, sipping the last of the champagne before the repo men could tag the bottle. She wasn't crying. She wasn't panicked. She was calculating. Tiffany hadn't stayed with Victor for his sparkling personality. She was an investor, and she had just realized her stock was crashing. As Victor argued futilely with the police on the deck, screaming about his rights, Tiffany pulled out her phone. She didn't call a lawyer for him. She opened her contacts and scrolled past Victor to a name she hadn't texted in 6 months. Brad, hedge fund. She typed a quick message. "Hey stranger, thinking of you. Dinner?" She watched Victor through the glass doors. He looked small, sweaty, desperate. The power that had made him attractive was evaporating like mist. She knew the yacht was gone. She knew the penthouse was compromised. But she needed to know if there was anything left to salvage before she cut her losses. When Victor finally stormed back inside, red-faced and panting, claiming he had handled it, despite the police clearly escorting them off the boat, Tiffany put on her best concerned face. She grabbed his arm, looking deep into his eyes, and asked the only question that mattered to her. She asked if they still had the Aspen house. She reminded him that it was in a different trust, a different state. She needed to know if there was one last bolt hole with expensive furniture. Victor hesitated, looking away. That hesitation told her everything she needed to know, but she decided to wait for the official confirmation before she called the Uber. The summons arrived electronically, pinging Victor's phone just as they were dumped on the curb outside the marina. It was a formal notification from the board of directors of Sterling Tech. An emergency leadership session was scheduled for 8 p.m. that night at headquarters. Victor stared at the screen and started to laugh. It was a manic, terrifying sound. He grabbed Tiffany's shoulders, shaking her slightly. He told her this was it. This was the turnaround. He convinced himself that the board wasn't meeting to fire him. They were meeting because they were panicked without him. They needed his vision. They needed his magic. He was the founder. Without him, the stock would hit zero. He dusted off his jacket, straightening his tie in the reflection of a shop window. The delusion took full hold. He told Tiffany to go back to the hotel, since they couldn't go home, and pack her bags. Not for running away, but for a victory lap. He promised her that by midnight, he would have the company back, Elena would be sued into oblivion, and they would be flying private to Paris. He hailed a taxi, an indignity he vowed never to repeat, and gave the driver the address of Sterling Tech. As the car merged into traffic, Victor practiced his speech in the rearview mirror. He practiced his winning smile. He practiced the look of benevolent forgiveness he would bestow upon the board members as they begged for his return. He had no idea that he wasn't heading to a coronation. He was heading to an autopsy. Victor arrived at the glass monolith of Sterling Tech at 7:55 p.m., 5 minutes early for his triumphant return. He strode across the marble lobby, straightening his tie, preparing to breeze past the security desk just as he had done for 15 years. He approached the private executive turnstile, the one reserved solely for the CEO, and slapped his keycard against the reader. He expected the satisfying chirp of access and the green light. Instead, the machine let out a harsh, low buzz. The light flashed red. Access denied. Victor frowned, swiping again. Harder. Buzz. He slapped the card against the reader, scratching the plastic. Buzz. Behind the reception desk, the night security guard, a man named Stan whom Victor had walked past 1,000 times without ever learning his name, cleared his throat. Victor spun around, ready to scream about faulty equipment. But Stan didn't look apologetic. He looked bored. He pointed to the visitor logbook on the counter. He told Victor that all non-employees had to sign in and wait for an escort. Victor's face went crimson. He screamed that he wasn't a visitor. He was the owner of the building. He threatened to fire Stan. He threatened to fire Stan's family. But Stan just tapped the sign-in sheet with a pen. Before Victor could lunge at him, 2 large, armed security officers stepped out from the shadows of the elevator bank. They didn't salute. They flanked him, one on each side, gripping his elbows with a force that was professional but firm. They told him they had orders to escort him directly to the boardroom. Victor was marched to the elevator not as a CEO, but as a prisoner in a $3,000 suit. The elevator ride to the 40th floor was silent and suffocating. Victor stood between the 2 guards, staring at the changing numbers, his heart hammering against his ribs. When the doors slid open, the executive hallway was dark, save for the light spilling out from the double doors of the main boardroom at the end of the corridor. The guards marched him down the hall. They pushed the heavy oak doors open, and Victor stumbled inside, ready to charm, beg, or bully the board into submission. The long mahogany table was full. Every member of the board of directors was present. Usually, when Victor entered a room, there was noise, people standing, greeting, shuffling papers. Tonight, there was dead silence. 12 pairs of eyes watched him with a mix of pity and cold detachment. But Victor's eyes went straight to the head of the table, to his chair, the massive, high-backed leather chair that faced the window. It was turned away from him. Someone was sitting in it. Victor let out a nervous, incredulous laugh. He asked who was sitting in his seat. He stepped forward, his voice booming with false confidence, demanding the usurper show themselves. Slowly, smoothly, the leather chair spun around. Victor's breath hitched in his throat. It wasn't a corporate raider. It wasn't a competitor. It was Elena. But it wasn't the Elena he knew. The beige cardigans were gone. The messy bun was gone. She was wearing a sharp, charcoal power suit that fit perfectly. Her hair was sleek and styled. She wore no jewelry except for a simple, terrifyingly expensive watch. She didn't look like a scorned wife. She looked like the CEO of a Fortune 500 company. She looked at Victor not with love, not with hate, but with the dispassionate gaze of a judge looking at a convict. Victor blinked, his brain unable to process the image in front of him. He laughed again, a desperate, cracking sound. He asked if this was a joke. He told Elena to get out of his chair before she embarrassed herself. He looked at the board members, waiting for them to laugh with him, to tell him this was just a birthday prank gone wrong. But no one laughed. The board members looked down at their tablets. Elena didn't stand up. She didn't scream. She simply leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table, interlacing her fingers. She spoke into the conference microphone, her voice amplified and crystal clear. She corrected him. She said it wasn't his chair. It was the chair of the majority shareholder. And since Vanguard Holdings held 51% of the voting stock, it was her chair. She had simply let him keep it warm for 20 years. Victor slammed his hands on the table, shouting that he built this company from nothing. He shouted that he was the visionary, the genius, the face on the magazine covers. He screamed that without him, Sterling Tech was nothing but bricks and servers. Elena waited for him to finish his tantrum. She picked up a document from the table, the agenda for the meeting. She looked him dead in the eye and delivered the line that would haunt him for the rest of his life. She told him that he was right about one thing. He had built the ego, but she reminded him that she had paid for the bricks. She then read item 1 on the agenda. Motion to terminate Victor Sterling for cause, gross misconduct, embezzlement, and violation of trust. Victor opened his mouth to argue, to fight, to charm. But Elena didn't give him the chance. She looked at the board and said 2 words, call the vote. Victor tried to protest, shouting that a vote was illegal without a hearing. He looked around the table, searching for an ally, for anyone who had laughed at his jokes or drunk his scotch. But Elena raised a single finger, and the room darkened. The massive presentation screen at the end of the room, the same screen Victor used to pitch billion-dollar ideas, descended from the ceiling. Elena didn't speak. She simply pressed a button on the control panel. The screen flickered to life. It wasn't a spreadsheet. It wasn't a stock chart. It was a high-definition video from the previous night's gala. The audio boomed through the surround sound speakers. Victor's voice, arrogant and slurred, mocking his wife. The board watched in uncomfortable silence as the video zoomed in on the $10 gift card, then panned to the $5 million yacht. Then, the slide changed. It showed a bank transfer receipt. Unauthorized withdrawal. $5 million. Corporate operating fund. Elena's voice cut through the darkroom. She explained that by gifting a company asset to a personal mistress, Victor hadn't just been a bad husband. He had committed embezzlement. She turned to the general counsel, who was taking notes in the corner. He stood up and adjusted his glasses. He confirmed that under the bylaws of the trust, this act constituted gross misconduct. He added that because the purchase was unauthorized, Victor was personally liable for the debt. In simple terms, Victor didn't just lose the boat. He owed the company $5 million he didn't have. The trap wasn't just emotional. It was mathematical. The lights came back up, revealing a Victor who looked like he had aged 10 years in 10 minutes. He was sweating, his tie crooked, his eyes darting around the room. He tried one last desperate play. He appealed to the board members by name. He looked at Frank, the man he golfed with every Sunday. He begged Frank to remember the good times, the profits, the wins. Frank stared at his notepad, refusing to make eye contact. He looked at Susan, whom he had promoted twice. Susan looked out the window. Elena didn't let the silence linger. She called for the vote. All in favor of the motion to terminate Victor Sterling and initiate the share reversion protocol. Elena raised her hand first. It was steady, unwavering. Then, slowly, Frank raised his hand. Then Susan. Then the rest. One by one, 12 hands went up in the air. It was a forest of betrayal. A unanimous execution. Victor stared at the hands, breathless. The general counsel spoke the final words of Victor's career. He declared the motion passed. He informed Victor that effective immediately, his employment was terminated, his salary was ceased, and his unvested stock options were forfeited back to the grantor. In the span of 60 seconds, Victor's net worth had dropped from 9 figures to 0. He wasn't a billionaire anymore. He was just a guy in a suit with a massive debt and no job. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Elena didn't want a long goodbye. She gestured to the security guards. They stepped forward, their movements practiced and efficient. One guard held out a plastic bin, the kind used at airport security checkpoints. He didn't ask nicely. He ordered Victor to place all company property in the bin. Victor stood frozen. The guard reached into Victor's jacket and pulled out his phone, the company phone. He took the laptop bag from Victor's shoulder. He even reached out and unclipped the security badge from Victor's lapel. Victor tried to grab it back, shouting that it was his name on the building, but the guard simply blocked his arm and pointed to the door. They grabbed him by the arms, not gently this time. They marched him out of the boardroom, past Elena, who didn't even turn her head to watch him go. She was already discussing the next agenda item with the board. Victor was dragged down the hallway, into the elevator, and down to the lobby. The lobby was no longer empty. It was shift change. Hundreds of employees were walking through the atrium. They stopped. They watched. They saw the great Victor Sterling, the man who had terrorized them for years, being frog-marched toward the revolving doors like a common shoplifter. No one helped him. No one looked sad. A few people actually pulled out their phones to film it. The guards pushed him through the doors and shoved him out onto the concrete sidewalk. Victor stumbled, nearly falling into a puddle. The glass doors locked behind him with a heavy thud. He stood there, shivering in the cool night air, without a phone, without a wallet, and without a kingdom. The rain began to fall, mixing with the sweat on his face, as he realized he didn't even have money for a cab. Victor stood shivering on the wet pavement, water soaking through his Italian leather shoes. He was a man who used to command armies of assistants with a snap of his fingers, but now he was reduced to begging. He spotted a young man, likely an unpaid intern, smoking a vape pen near the loading dock. Victor rushed over, his eyes wild, and demanded to borrow the kid's phone. The intern hesitated, recognizing the face from the news alerts that were currently lighting up every screen in the city. He unlocked his cracked iPhone and handed it over, not out of respect, but out of fear. Victor's trembling fingers dialed the only number he knew by heart besides his own. He called Tiffany. He needed a ride. He needed a place to stay. He needed to hear that someone was still on his side. He expected her to be frantic, to be waiting with the car running. Tiffany answered on the second ring. Her voice wasn't frantic, it was bored. Background noise suggested she was at a restaurant, a loud, expensive one. Victor started babbling, explaining that it was all a legal mistake, that he just needed her to pick him up so they could regroup. He told her he loved her. There was a pause on the line. Then, Tiffany sighed, the sound of ice clinking in a glass. She told him that she had seen the press conference. She knew about the stock reversion. She knew about the debt. She told him bluntly that she didn't date projects. She mentioned that Brad from the hedge fund had just offered to fly her to Cabo for the weekend to help her get over the trauma of the day. Victor screamed her name into the phone, begging her not to do this. Tiffany didn't argue. She simply said, "Goodbye, Victor," and the line went dead. Victor stared at the screen. The call ended, notification mocking him, until the intern snatched the phone back and scurried away, leaving the former billionaire talking to the dial tone. With no money for a taxi and no friends left to call, Victor began to walk. He walked for 40 blocks through the rain, his expensive suit becoming heavy and sodden, his hair plastered to his skull. He headed toward the only sanctuary he had left, the Upper East Side townhouse that he and Elena had lived in for 15 years. He convinced himself that the electronic locks wouldn't be updated yet. He convinced himself that he could break a window if he had to. He just needed to get inside, get dry, and find something to sell. He arrived at the townhouse after midnight. The street was quiet. The house looked dark, menacing. Victor climbed the steps and punched his code into the keypad. 1-9-9-9, the year he started the company. The light flashed red. He tried again. Red. He tried Elena's birthday. Red. Panic set in. He started pounding on the heavy oak door, shouting for the housekeeper, for the butler, for anyone. But the staff had been dismissed hours ago. The house was empty. Suddenly, the intercom speaker crackled to life. Victor froze, hope rising in his chest. But it wasn't a person. It was a pre-recorded message, synthesized and cold. Access denied. This property is now under the conservatorship of Vanguard Holdings. Trespassing will trigger an immediate police response. Please step away from the door. Victor stepped back, looking up at the dark windows of the master bedroom. He realized with a sick feeling in his stomach that Elena wasn't just kicking him out. She was erasing him. She had anticipated every move. She had changed the locks before the board meeting even started. He was locked out of his life. Victor sat down on the bottom step of his own front porch. He was exhausted, shivering violently, and for the first time in 20 years, he felt the gnawing pain of actual hunger. He patted his pockets, looking for anything: a mint, a forgotten credit card, a loose bill. His hands were numb. He found nothing in his left pocket. In his right pocket, his fingers brushed against a piece of plastic. He pulled it out, holding it up to the dim light of the street lamp. It was orange. It was plastic. It was the $10 coffee shop gift card. He stared at it. The irony hit him like a physical blow. 24 hours ago, he had held this card up on a stage to humiliate his wife. He had laughed at it. He had called it chump change. He had told her not to spend it all in one place. Now he realized with a terrifying clarity that this piece of plastic was his entire net worth. The billions were gone. The stocks were gone. The mistress was gone. The only asset Victor Sterling possessed in the entire world was the $10 his wife had left him. He started to laugh, a broken, sobbing sound that echoed down the empty street. He clutched the card to his chest like a lifeline, realizing that he had to survive the night, and this gift card was the only way he was going to do it. Victor stumbled into the 24-hour coffee shop on 3rd Avenue, the bell above the door chiming a cheerful sound that felt entirely out of place. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, harsh and unforgiving, illuminating his soaked suit, and the mud splattered on his trousers. He looked like a madman, or worse, a fallen king. The barista, a tired college student with purple hair, didn't even look up from her phone as he approached the counter. Victor stood there, water dripping from his nose onto the linoleum floor. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the orange plastic card. His hand shook as he placed it on the counter. He cleared his throat, his voice raspy from the cold. He ordered a small black coffee and a bagel. It was the most humble meal he had ordered in 30 years. The barista sighed, punched in the order, and picked up the scanner. Victor held his breath. If this card didn't work, if Elena had canceled this too, he would truly have nothing. The scanner beeped. Balance remaining, $4, the barista mumbled, handing him the receipt. Victor took his tray and sat at a small table by the window. He wrapped his hands around the paper cup, letting the heat seep into his frozen fingers. He took a sip. It was bitter, cheap coffee. It tasted like survival. As he chewed the dry bagel, his eyes wandered to the newsstand rack next to the sugar station. There, staring back at him from the cover of Forbes magazine, was a face he knew better than his own. But it wasn't his face. It was Elena's. The headline screamed in bold gold letters, "The Silent Partner Speaks." How Elena Sterling reclaimed her empire. Victor stared at the photo. She looked radiant, powerful, and completely unbothered. He realized then that she hadn't just been his wife. She had been his safety net, his bank, and his conscience. And he had cut the net himself. He sat in the bright, lonely coffee shop, drinking the coffee she paid for, reading about the success she achieved without him, while the city outside moved on as if he had never existed. 3 months later, the sun was setting over the Mediterranean, painting the sky in hues of purple and gold. The superyacht, formerly known as the Sea Queen, now renamed the Vanguard, cut through the calm waters. But Victor Sterling wasn't on the deck. He was back in New York, working as a junior consultant for a mid-tier firm, trying to pay off a $5 million debt that would take him 3 lifetimes to clear. On the deck of the Vanguard, Elena Sterling sat in a lounge chair, wearing a simple white dress and holding a glass of vintage wine. She wasn't alone. Sitting across from her were her loyal general counsel and Marcus, the CFO Victor had fired, whom she had immediately rehired as CEO. They were reviewing the quarterly projections. The company was up 20%. Morale was at an all-time high. The cancer of Victor's ego had been cut out, and the patient was thriving. Marcus closed the folder and smiled. We received a letter from Victor's lawyer today, he said. He's asking if we can release the embargo on his personal clothes. He says he needs his winter coats. Elena took a sip of wine, looking out at the horizon where the sea met the sky. She thought about the 20 years of silence. She thought about the old furniture comment. She thought about the girl in the library who just wanted to be loved, not used. She set her glass down and smiled, a genuine, warm smile that reached her eyes. Tell him, Elena said softly, that the clothes were donated to charity months ago. But if he's cold, send him a $10 gift card. I hear they sell great coffee. And that, my friends, is how the game is played. Victor wanted a trophy life, but he forgot the most important rule of the billionaire class. Never play against the person who owns the scoreboard. If you enjoyed watching justice being served ice cold, hit that subscribe button. I'm Mr. James, and I'll see you in the next story.